Chapter 10. Graduation. Bradigan had to fight the urge to laugh as he looked at Tika. The Crovan girl was standing at attention like a fresh-faced cadet in the castle guard awaiting her first orders from the drill sergeant. Her expression was a pale imitation of serious determination, the illusion being thoroughly broken down by the sparkle of delight in her eyes and the routine twitching in her cheeks and tail feathers. Her gaze kept darting off to the side, where Aveline and Jetta, the official witness assigned to the proceedings by the assemblage, both looked on with amusement. They were standing in the front room of Bradigan's workshop, with the store having been closed up early for the day so they could enjoy what was about to happen free of distractions. Early summer sunlight streamed in through the windows, lending a soothing warmth to everything. The high season heat may have been uncomfortable, had it not been nullified by coils of metal secured in the corners of the room. They faintly glowed with ring light, enchanted to absorb summer heat and keep the interior space at a comfortable temperature year-round. Just one of many little things Tika had made in her spare time since she started going out with Aveline. His eyes settled on the human woman in particular. Tika and Aveline had been seeing each other for a couple of seasons now. There had been some awkward tension at the start, of course. They had needed time to finish working through the drama revolving around Aveline's enchantment, and both of them were so dreadfully inexperienced at this whole romance thing that it was a wonder they hadn't lit themselves on fire yet. Still, those little hurdles aside, they were making it work, and Bradigan couldn't have been happier for it. Returning to the task at hand, Bradigan turned his attention to Jetta. The Crovan gave him a nod. No more stalling, then.
Time to put this matter to bed.
Bradigan looked at Tika. He stood up straight and folded his hands behind his back.
Tika Windwhisper,
he began, addressing her by her full name. She immediately stood bolt upright, tensing. Bradigan continued.
It has been several years since I first ran into you and your mother on the streets of Lodon. Several years since you all but begged me to take you under my wing when you learned of my profession. Several years since I first brought you here to Underbridge and into the halls of my home. When we first met, I saw in you a spark of potential that I've rarely seen. The potential to master the craft I have devoted my entire life to learning. I saw in you the potential to become a fine Enchantress.
He allowed a smile to break apart his professional expression.
Little did I know, fine would be the greatest understatement of my life. Never in 1,000 years could I have realized that I would so thoroughly underestimate that potential. In the years you've spent learning from me, you have exceeded my expectations at every turn. You have made me endlessly proud to call you my student, Tika, and it has been my profound honor and delight to have you in my home.
Tika began to puff up with pride, and Bradigan knew the girl well enough to recognize that she was blushing under those feathers. Bradigan smirked at her, then clapped his hands together.
And so it is that I've called you here today. I, Bradigan Gandalford, in my capacity as a certified enchanter recognized by the administration of the Arcanian Assemblage, the laws of Emira, and the city of Underbridge, hereby recognize you, Tika Windwhisper, as a full-fledged Enchantress. Your tutelage under me is officially over.
At those words, Jetta stepped forward, a scroll of parchment and a quill in his hands. As representative and witness from the Arcanian Assemblage, I recognize the validity of Bradigan's decision, he stated authoritatively. Then, with a grin, he wrote something down on his parchment and passed it to Bradigan. The dwarf took the sheet and looked it over for any blemishes or mistakes. There were none. It was a certificate of graduation, legally establishing Tika's right to freely practice the craft of enchantment. So long as she followed the laws and regulations placed on the craft, of course. He ran his thumb briefly over her name written in large, flowing letters, then handed the sheet of parchment to Tika.
Congratulations, lass, he said softly. As of this moment, you are a full-fledged Enchantress.
Tika took the certificate in her hands, careful not to rip it with her claws. She looked it over for a few seconds, her beak working up and down, but with no sounds coming out. Her eyes shimmered, her tail feathers twitched this way and that. A moment later, she let out the loudest, shrillest cry of joy that Bradigan had ever heard from her. She jumped up and down in place, then threw herself against him in the tightest hug he had ever felt from her. Then, to his shock and rapidly growing horror, she actually tried to lift him.
Uh-oh.
Tika squealed.
Thank you so much, Brad! Thank you! Ah!
Her arms gave out and Bradigan fell back to his feet with a loud clunk. He laughed and opened his mouth to say something, but Tika was already on the move. She turned and ran for Aveline next. The human was prepared for the charge. She put a foot back, braced herself, and expertly snatched Tika up into a spinning hug.
Congratulations, Tika.
Aveline cried out once they stopped spinning, holding Tika close.
I'm so happy for you. Thanks, Eva.
Tika squealed, pulling back for a moment. She pressed the tip of her beak to Aveline's nose, and the sound of an exaggerated kiss echoed throughout the chamber. Aveline laughed and did her best to return to the display of affection, but Tika was already flitting to Jeddah to hug him. The Kraven grunted as Tika barreled into him, sending him staggering back.
And you too, Jeddah,
she told him, squeezing him tight. Jeddah shook his head in bewilderment. Whatever on Oris did I do? He asked, though there was no hiding the smile in his voice.
You were a friend whenever you swung by,
Tika told him, pulling back to poke him on the tip of his beak.
And you encouraged me a bunch whenever stuff got scary. And you're here for this.
Jeddah chuckled, brushing her finger away from his beak. Yes. Well, you're very welcome, little Tika, he said. And for the record, I never once doubted you. I saw the same potential in you as Bradigan when we first met. Even back then, I knew you were destined for success. He reached out with a warm smile, ruffling the feathers on her head. Tika laughed and swatted his hand away. He grinned, then cleared his throat. Now, with all of that said, I am afraid this is when I must take my leave. Tika frowned.
What? Oh, come on! You've barely even gotten in through the door, but now you have to go?
Jeddah shrugged helplessly. Forgive me, Tika. I wish I could stay longer, truly I do. But I was sent here to serve as the assemblage's eyes on the matter. That task is now done, and so I must pass along word of this development to the assemblage. And I have to ensure that your status as an enchantress is properly archived. And I have other professional work to which I must attend. Tika slumped in place, disappointed.
Okay. I understand.
Jeddah smiled and pat her on the shoulder. Fret not, child. I'll have plenty of time to speak more in the future. And besides, he looked at Bradigan, I don't wish to impose on any of your personal celebrations. Bradigan nodded appreciatively, stepping forward. Well, it's a shame you have to go so soon, but I understand. You go do your thing, Jeddah. Of course. Jetta bowed his head to each of them in turn. Until we meet again. And again, congratulations to all of you. Tika waved after him as he started for the door.
Thanks again, Jetta. Bye.
Jetta gave her a smile. Farewell, Tika. I get the impression that you and I will be working rather closely with one another in the future, he said. He lifted his hand to return the wave, and then he was out the door. It clicked shut behind him with a thud. There was a moment of quiet as everyone started to come down from Tika's infectious excitement. Then Aveline gave Tika a huge grin, ran over, and gave the poor girl a massive kiss on the side of the beak. Tika chirped and went rigid as a rod in Aveline's grasp, her eyes flying wide. Bradigan resisted the urge to laugh at her. She had never really gotten used to being on the receiving end of physical affection from Aveline. At least not when Bradigan was in the room to see it. Bradigan turned to face the pair and clapped his hands together.
Alrighty, that's enough of all this formal crap,
he declared before holding out his arms and surging after Tika himself. Aveline saw the dwarf coming and promptly abandoned her girlfriend to her fate. Tika barely had time to chirp before she was all but tackled off her feet by Bradigan. He tugged her down into a tight hug, patting her on the back.
I am so proud of you. Oh, look at you, lass. My little bird, a full-fledged Enchantress, and all grown up, too. You know, I remember when I first brought you here, you were just the tiniest little tweeter getting stuck in my armoire.
He said, throwing aside any sense of decorum or professionalism. He took hold of her cheeks to grin into her face. Tika smiled more tenderly, placing her hand on his.
Thanks, Brad. But come on, don't sell yourself short. I never would have gotten anywhere if you hadn't agreed to start teaching me.
I never sell myself short. I'm a dwarf.
Bradigan shot back with a coy smile. Tika rolled her eyes.
That's not what I meant, you dork.
The two shared a good-natured laugh, hugging it out one more time before Bradigan backed off to give her some space. He sized her up for a few seconds, grinning widely.
So, how's about some muffins, eh? To celebrate?
Tika blinked at him.
Huh? You got muffins?
She asked. Bradigan snickered at her.
Sure did. Got the biggest batch from Irene that I could afford,
he said, nodding toward the door to the dining room.
Hit him in the kitchen.
Tika's eyes flew wide, and she marched up to him.
And how in the heck did I not notice?
She asked, baffled. Bradigan smirked teasingly. He poked her on the tip of the beak.
You know, you Craven don't have particularly strong noses. Just had to keep you distracted long enough to sneak him by. And nothing distracts you more than a certain freckle-faced girl standing, I don't know, about 10 feet behind you.
Tika spun around to gawp at Aveline, her neck feathers ruffling.
Ava! You didn't!
Aveline raised her hand.
Guilty as charged,
she confessed happily. Tika stared at her for a few seconds. Then she turned and sprinted out of the room with a crow-like caw.
Ah!
Heading for the kitchen. Bradigan and Aveline shared a glance, then a laugh, before setting off after the energetic bird.
So, what's your plan?
Bradigan asked a little while later. Once the trio were comfortably seated in the kitchen, enjoying freshly warmed blueberry muffins and cups of steaming tea. Tika just clamped her beak down on her third muffin. She looked up at Bradigan as she tore the pastry in half.
Huh?
She asked through it. Bradigan gestured at her.
Well, now that you've graduated, what are you planning to do?
he clarified. Tika blinked, considering her response. She swallowed down the chunk of muffin and crossed her arms, her brow furrowed in consternation.
Huh. You know, I have no idea. I've been working toward this for so long that I didn't even stop to think about what comes next. I guess I could open my own workshop,
she mused quietly. Bradigan smirked.
What, and put your crusty old teacher out of business with your fancy work?
Aveline blinked at him from Tika's side.
Did you just call yourself crusty?
Tika nodded.
I think he did. Is Bradigan crusty? I mean, he gets crumbs in his beard sometimes, and if they have sauce it can dry, and then that gets kind of crusty.
Bradigan slammed his hands down on the table.
Hey! Don't go taking my terms of endearment and making him insulting,
he bellowed. The two unrepentant women just laughed, but they nonetheless stopped pursuing the matter. Bradigan shook his head.
Suna help me, he grumbled, rubbing at his forehead. It was bad enough when it was just Tika. Now there's two of you.
Tika snickered again, then leaned across the table for him.
I'm sorry. I mean, do you have a better idea, though?
She asked. She gestured vaguely.
I mean, what else am I gonna do? I can't just go and open a workshop back home. Loden's way too small for there to be any demand for an Enchantress, and, well, I mean, at least here in Underbridge I'm known about.
As she was speaking, Bradigan put on a large smile. It was time to reveal his secret plan.
True. Those are all very valid points, lass,
he said slowly, making a show of stroking his beard. He was also taking the chance to brush away some crumbs, but that was beside the point.
You could open up your own workshop, sure. But I think I have a better idea.
Tika tilted her head at him.
Huh? You do?
She asked. She lifted up her muffin to start nibbling on it again.
What is it?
Bradigan nodded.
Well, You see, kid, I'm not getting any younger. You noticed it long before I did. But I've been popping and cracking just about every time I sit down or stand up. I got stiffs and aches and pains in places I never used to. Need to wear my stupid monocle more often just to read my own damn notes when I'm working. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to keep doing this job, frankly,
he explained, frowning slightly with discontentment. He looked down at his tea for a second and took a healthy swig before continuing.
But I'm not the sort to let this place close up and collect dust. No, sir. When I start getting too old and tired to work, I want to make sure that the place can keep doing what I opened it to do. And I want to make sure I leave it in good hands.
He lifted his eyes to Tika, meeting her gaze intently. He reached across the table and took her hand in his.
And lass, I can't think of any hands better than yours.
Tika's eyes widened. Bradigan paused, and his smile softened considerably.
I'm gonna level with you. In the time you've been living with me, I've gotten real attached to you. And I ain't too keen on letting you go quite that easily, so if you want, it'd be my delight if you'd stick around. Not as my student, but as my partner. Joint ownership of my workshop between you and me, to pass wholly to you when I retire.
He gave her hand a firm squeeze.
So, what do you say?
Tika stared at him in shock for several long seconds, her face comically contorted as she was still in the process of eating a muffin when Bradigan revealed all of this. Swallowing, she shook herself and took hold of Bradigan's hand in both of her own. Her face was alight with a gigantic grin.
That sounds wonderful, Bradigan. Thank you.
She trilled.
Is there any paperwork to sign? The stuff usually comes with paperwork.
Bradigan shook his head and held up a hand.
Now, we can worry about that later,
he assured her. He released her hand and sat back.
I take it that's a yes then?
Of course it is,
Tika declared, thrusting her arms up into the air.
Loud, resounding, reverberant, and in other words, that means it goes around a bunch. Echoing,
Aveline supplied helpfully.
That too, yes!
Bradigan laughed at the pair again.
Well, I'm glad to hear it,
he said, relieved. It had been foolish of him, he knew, but part of him had feared that Tika would reject the offer.
Don't know what I was thinking,
he thought, smiling.
But before any of that stuff can happen, you're supposed to be heading back to Loden and spending some time with your mom, ain't you?
Tika grinned even wider, if that was even possible.
That's right, Mom,
she exclaimed.
She'll want to hear all about this, and you, and Ava.
And then Tika paused. Her grin faded and she turned back to face Aveline. Aveline tilted her head, concerned.
Tika? Is something wrong?
She asked, reaching a hand out. Tika nodded, looking down.
Yeah, you know my mom doesn't live in Underbridge. She's all the way out in Loden. That's a few days' ride south of here. So when I go to see her, I'm gonna have to be away from you two again.
Aveline smiled warmly.
Hey, it's all right. I don't mind. You haven't seen your mom since spring, and I don't want to intrude.
Tika turned to Aveline, shaking her head.
I know. I love spending time with Mom and all, don't get me wrong, but I just hate leaving you behind, you know?
Aveline smiled that gentle smile that always seemed to quiet down Tika's nerves.
Don't worry, Tika. You'll be back soon enough,
she said, lovingly stroking the Kraven's beak.
You just focus on spending time with your mother, okay?
Tika sighed, looking down.
I will. Just wish I could take you with me,
she finally lamented.
I wish she could meet you.
Bradigan grinned. It was time for secret weapon number 2.
About that,
he prompted, drawing both of their attention. He leaned forward in his seat, interlacing his fingers together on the table.
Now, I figured something like this would come up, which is why last time I wrote to your mother, Tika, I made it a point to ask if she would be all right with you bringing some company along.
Tika squawked in alarm. Her tea and muffins forgotten, she shot up in her seat, her hands slamming down on the table.
What? Brad! Seriously?
She cawed.
Seriously.
A pause.
What did she say?
Bradigan burst out laughing. He fixed Tika with a large grin.
She said that she's all right with you bringing along this girlfriend of yours you keep swooning at her about, just so long as she still gets plenty of time with her little girl.
He turned his attention to Aveline.
And, of course, as long as Aveline's father is okay with it.
Tika clacked her beak a few times, her eyes darting around as she processed this bucket load of revelations. She turned to Aveline, stunned.
Aveline? Are you...
She asked quietly.
Do you want to come?
The question was so timid that Aveline snickered. She took Tika's beak in her hands again and planted a very light kiss on the tip. Tika chirped in surprise, flushing again as Aveline leaned back.
I'll have to get my dad's approval for it, but if he says it's all right, then yes, I would love to come. Besides, you've got my dad's approval already. I should get your mother's.
Tika clacked her beak again, and then she grinned.
Yes!
She squealed in triumphant victory, throwing herself against Aveline once more and absolutely smothering her face with affectionate nuzzles. All the while, the mimicked sound of human kisses incessantly emanated from her throat. Aveline laughed, returning the embrace and returning the kisses to the best of her ability. She didn't make it all that far, as nothing could keep up with Tika when she was feeling affectionate and hyper. Bradigan grinned.
Well then, lassie, you might want to go and pack up your things while I put some dinner on, he instructed. We're gonna be setting out tomorrow, don't forget.
Tika nodded. She quickly scarfed down what remained of her final muffin, got up, and ran over to give him a hug. Then she was out of the room, vanishing through the door into the corridor beyond. Aveline and Bradigan watched her go. Every so often, jubilant chirps and whistles could be heard as Tika moved around in her room. Aveline let out a dreamy sigh.
She's adorable,
she whispered quietly. Bradigan nodded, giving Aveline a sidelong glance.
Hey, that she is.
Aveline looked across the table at Bradigan, her smile growing slightly.
Hey, Bradigan?
She began quietly.
Yeah?
Thank you.
Bradigan crooked a brow, surprised.
For what?
Aveline fidgeted for a few seconds, toying with her bracelet. She looked after Tika again, and her smile returned.
For bringing Tika here.
She finally said.
And for keeping my secret.
Bradigan nodded slowly. He couldn't say he approved of the fact that Aveline had sought out a flesh enchanter for her heart problems, but what was done, and he had to admit that the operation had probably saved her life. In the end, despite his own personal and professional objections with Aveline's choice, he had promised to keep quiet about it. He smiled.
Don't sweat it, kid. You deserve better than you got.
Aveline shook her head.
No. I think I got better than what I deserve.
She countered.
Because I got Tika. That stubborn little bird. And I wouldn't have it any other way.
Bradigan stared at her for a few seconds, then smiled.
Well, why don't you go and help her pack up then?
He suggested. He stood from his seat and walked around the table to give Aveline a clap on the back.
Don't let me get in the way.
Aveline stepped into motion without hesitation. She flashed Bradigan a grateful smile, then disappeared out of the dining room. Bradigan watched her go, listening to her footfalls as she disappeared into Tika's room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He shook himself, then turned to look out the room's only window and up at the pale ring. He took a deep breath.
Well, end of an era, eh?
He muttered under his breath, comfortable in the knowledge that though this chapter of their time together was coming to a close, a whole new one awaited just around the bend.
Can't wait to see what happens next,
he said with finality.